Welcome to Sheffield's Lessons in Leadership. Today we're speaking with Steve Tucker, who's a professional board director and chair with extensive governance experience across privately owned, public sector and listed companies. Steve is currently chair of Gallagher Holdings, where he previously held a range of senior executive positions over 20 years. Gallagher is involved in three key business areas of design, manufacturing and marketing of a range of agricultural and security management products and systems. It employs over 1,100 people worldwide and exports approximately 80% of its total sales to over 100 countries. Gallagher is indeed a New Zealand success story. Good morning, Steve. It's great to be speaking with you today, and we look forward to learning more about your leadership experience and your leadership journey. But I'm sure the lessons you've got for us will be impactful and meaningful. So thank you very much for your time, firstly.
No, thank you, Ian. Look forward to the discussion.
Steve, perhaps a good place to start would be your leadership journey generally, and it would be interested to know a little bit about your leadership journey, how you sort of got into it, so to speak, and what are the important influences along the way in shaping your approach to leadership.
Okay. No, thanks, Ian. Hey, look, well, I suppose I've been lucky enough to have worked for the Gallagher Group in Hamilton. I've been part of their journey for the last 25 years and sort of been really lucky to have started with a company that was sort of only turning over $40 million and a couple hundred staff, and to have been part of the journey that saw that company grow to today, sort of 400 million and sort of 1,200 staff. So over that period of time, I've had sort of a number of executive positions, most of them in the early days in sort of finance and operational related roles. But the bigger part of my journey has been there as Deputy Chief Executive and as a board member, and currently the chair of the Gallagher Group. So about 5 years ago, I transitioned into professional board governance. I'm really lucky to have been working for a sort of number of mostly technology companies and a mix of sort of private and listed sort of entities, and from small to large, and things like Gallagher, Raycon, Good Nature, Tasker, etc. So my journey's been one of sort of a good, long, solid period of time with a really great company that's taught me a lot, and then transitioning that leadership experience to the board table.
And through that time, has there been a person, an individual, or individuals who have been either mentor, coach, who you've role modeled yourself in terms of a leadership model?
Yeah, I'm sort of reluctant to sort of say one person, because I think you mold yourself based on a number. So I think you take pieces from each individual person. But look, one thing that's really shaped my leadership style has been working for such a long period of time with Gallagher's, and particularly with Sir William Gallagher. I think the thing for me is that I think I've always been a traditional type A personality, talk and think fast, do it now, sense of urgency and restlessness. But I think when you work for a company that's been around for nearly 85 years, you realize how much value there is in just doing things consistently right and incrementally over a very long period of time, and sort of thinking outside your leadership time frame and the role of leaving the company in a better position for the next leader. And I think Sir William Gallagher's second generation, looking to pass it to third, they're very much long-term thinking. I can think of many times in my career where I've been impatient or wanting to get it done tomorrow, but we've just taken the time to reflect on it and to make sure that it fits into our longer strategy. So very much I would credit my long-term thinking with Sir William Gallagher. Yeah, so that's on the people front. I mean, we've had other influences that have shaped my leadership from what you've been exposed to perspective, but on the people front, I'd credit a lot of that with him.
Okay, no, that's good to know, and it's a significant business that's done very well over time. So
thank you.
The leadership model is quite valid and credible. In terms of principles of leadership, as you've sort of shaped your style, are there principles you come back to consistently that you've learned over time work for you and the businesses that you've led?
Yeah, I think when I talked about the early days, I think I came from a far more a finance and operational background, and I was probably a little bit more black and white and analytical in my thinking. About 10 years ago, through Gallagher, we got sort of exposed to what I call design thinking, and that really deepened my understanding of brand and culture and purpose and values as really being the key ingredients of success. A quote that resonated with me at the time was which still sticks with me today is, that saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I tend to look at companies now through this purpose and culture lens as much as I look at it through the traditional, what are they doing and how they're doing it. So I put as sort of number one on that, and it does sound a bit cliche in today, but we talk about building a strong culture centered around a shared purpose. So I truly believe that as a leader, you need to be personally excited about the purpose and the products and industry you're in. It's your job to excite others to join and to stay and be part of the journey. So, number one, I'd really put that building a strong culture centered around a shared purpose. So, that would be sort of one of my key sort of principles that I come back to. I think the other one I just mentioned earlier was thinking long term. So I'm talking here not about having a 3 to 5 year strategy, but thinking about a company that's going to be around and thriving outside your own leadership time frame. I think it's really great, and there's a lot of quick wins to be had, but I've sort of learned a little bit that really long-term sustainable results normally happen over a long period of time. So thinking long-term, taking the short-term horizon out of it would be another one. I think another key principle I personally live by is again, probably a bit cliche, but is the 80-20 rule. I think in the early days, I probably, coming from a finance background, got caught in seeking perfection. I think once you sort of adopt a bit of an 80-20 rule, you sort of learn to encourage people to get enough data to have a reasonable level of confidence, but then adjust it along the way rather than sort of getting caught in that sort of paralysis by analysis. What else? A couple of things. I think one for me is, and I think, again, my time at Gallagher in particular, realizing there's more than one right way. I think, you can get too caught up sometimes in feeling like you're walking a path and you're going to come to a junction and there's a right or a wrong. But I tend to sort of think of it more like there's an empty space in front of you and you're forging a new road. You'll never know whether the other path would have been better or worse. So I think when you sort of learn to think like that, you observe things, you pick your battles, and you're far more open to giving things a go. I think that's another one. I think finally the other one I thought of is really important to me, and that's to try and make all interactions a win-win. I think it's really critical in interactions you have with whether that be a customer, a supplier, or staff, or shareholders. I think that you don't get too caught up in your view of the right way. I think everyone's got slightly differing needs, and they sometimes compromising to bend to others' needs. I don't think it's a sign of weakness, but I think it's really going to serve you in the long term. And I think people that know me well, they always comment that the saying that I have at the end of any difficult discussion or negotiations, I always turn to people and I say, are you comfortable with where we got to? And I think that's just the way I do that final check on, has this interaction, we might not, I don't think we're all going to be 100% happy, but you can't leave people unhappy with an interaction, and otherwise they get it back on you somehow. So, that's just, for me, I think it's really important that all interactions are win-win and that you keep that in mind.
Have those principles of leadership developed quite gradually and incrementally over time, or can you think back to sort of pivotal moments when you shifted quite quickly from one view to another in understanding what was going to be effective for you in terms of your leadership style?
Yeah, I think part of them, I would say that ironically, being a type A personality, thinking and talking fast and feeling that you sort of know the right way at times, I think, I don't know if it's age or just maturity, but I think anything that I've done to slow myself has actually improved these leadership techniques. So, I've been on my own personal journey of self-development, and we all know the cliches of eat better, exercise more, have a better work-life balance. I think anything that I've done to slow myself, I think, has improved my creativity, allowed me to reflect on things and think about what's more critical than something else. And so a lot of these things, they haven't been with me. I think they've been more successful for me as I move into more governance role, and we're looking for perhaps a board that is guiding and steering the company and is calm, rather than perhaps in the early days where I was perhaps potentially a bit more aggressive and want to move fast. So I think neither of them are right or wrong. I think there's a time and a place for all leadership styles, but I certainly think anything that I've been working on that is, and I think, like I say, working for Gallagher for 25 years and being at one company and seeing it grow the way it has with steady long-term growth has been a key part as well.
You mentioned a really interesting thing there in terms of a shift in style when you move from an executive role to a governance role. What are you conscious of as you leave your executive office and you walk into the boardroom of your approach changing in any way?
Yeah, I think for me, I think working as a professional director on a number of boards, I think you have to understand for each of those companies, and whereas before I used to only work for one, so I was hugely immersed in one company. Now I need to understand for every company the market that they operate in. I have to need to understand their competitors, their channels, their target marketings, their positioning, etc. And I think at times this can seem like a bit of a real data overload and board papers stretching from 100 to 200 pages for one meeting. So I think as a result, I've had to get a lot better at staying big picture focused, really quickly identifying what are the key value drivers and continually bringing the conversation and the discussion back to these rather than getting lost in the weeds, so to speak. So I think by staying big picture focused, I think you have to not sweat the small stuff and learn to let go and focus on where it's critical. So I think, again, that's probably been the change for me is realizing that across 5 or 6 companies, you can't know it as well as one. So you really have to focus quickly on the key value drivers.
Okay, that's really helpful and a good distinction. The last few years and the last 2 in particular, businesses and individuals and organisations and governments generally have faced rapid change and disruption. How have those influences affected your leadership style? And I guess there are 2 phases to this. Rapid change and disruption was happening before the pandemic, and the pandemic accelerated those things. So the leadership learnings, I suppose, have been progressive through that period. What impact have they had on you and your approach to leadership?
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, there's obviously an accelerating pace of change and disruption well before COVID. I think that will continue. There's an increasing pace of change, more business complexity, huge role of digital, higher social license to operate. So there's a lot of dynamics happening. And I think what that's taught me more than anything is how little I know. I don't mean that in an arrogant way, but it really has opened my eyes now. The pace of change is really bringing to home how little I don't know. And I think you don't want to fall into the trap of falling back to the things you do know and based on what experiences. You don't want to be that one at the board table that this is what we did here, this is what we did here, because they're not always relevant in today's world. So I think I've become a lot more open to different views and in particular, bringing in specialised and focused expertise. I think I grew up in an era of, a number 8 wire mentality, do it yourself, learn. But I think now there's a whole lot more that we as both board and leaders need to bring in specialist and focused expertise on particular topics. I think another thing that's changed for me is, innovation and disruption is here to stay. Product life cycles are shorter. Customers and are quicker to swap and to take on a disruptive product or a new product. And I think for me, in my leadership style, for me, this has meant that I'm more willing to take bigger bets and invest in disruptive technologies, particularly in R&D, far more than I have historically. Way back in my early days, pace of life was slower. You made sure you had all the right analysis and you made incremental changes to products. I think now we're in a world where you want to take calculated bets. I separate that from stupid risks, but calculated bigger bets, and you really want to be investing in disruptive technology. So, yeah, again, I've got my head around that far more. I think finally in the space of disruption, and certainly as a result of COVID, I think good leadership's becoming overall far more critical than it ever has been. I think everybody, consumers, employees, investors, I think overall they've got a huge amount of choice. And they can make and exercise that choice on very subjective factors, and they're doing that quicker and easier than they ever have in the past. And so, as a consequence, I think there's a lot more focus needed by leaders and boards in the areas of talent acquisition and retention and brand and reputation. I think those are becoming, definitely the topics of at the front of board agendas now compared to what they were historically.
So in terms of that area of talent acquisition and retention, the impact of change, particularly the last couple of years on workforces and on individuals has been huge. What have those been in your experience, and how, as a leader, have you focused on, I suppose, the emerging issues of well-being and health and reward in the workplace?
Yeah, I think, Ian, this is sort of related to me. I think it's an extension of the ESG bar and the social license to operate that companies have. And I think, the decisions for consumers to buy or employees to work or investors to invest in, it's not really just about having a great product at the right price, but it is really about the brand and reputation of the organization overall, the well-being of, people, place, and planet. So on a personal front, I think there's been some really, prior to the pandemic even, I think there has been some disturbing trends in social inequality over the last few decades. And I think the jury is out about whether the current economic model can solve it on its own. So I think this increasing pressures on companies from employees and the public to be better corporate citizens, I think overall is a good thing. And I think boards are needing to think about these things and bring these issues into the boardroom. So I think, there's certainly, the old model of everyone coming into the office, I think is having to be adjusted and be flexible. And I think that's a good thing for employees and employers. I think, many of us worried about the productivity of people working from home, but I think, when you look at the better life balance that employees are having overall as a consequence, and less travel, less cost of travel, etc., I think it's opening up companies to be more open about taking on workforces that are, for us, let's say Gallagher as an example, in the Waikato, we had a very limited pool of employees to draw from. As a consequence, we're far more open about where those people are located and being able to bring in specialist skill set. But I think, really the focus on staff well-being, I think overall is something that needed to happen. And COVID, I think, accelerated that. It gave people a taste of what could be better for them. And I think, we've got, I think overall, everybody is perhaps less loyal than my 25 years working for one company. And I think it's no good moaning about it. It's best to just get on board and, to work with it and to see it for what it is, which is just the new way of working, for want of a better word.
You talked about the change in economic models that might work better, not only work better for businesses, but work better for people and employees and for society more generally. That's a really interesting question, because sort of pure capitalism, as it's known, is now being questioned in terms of addressing equity and inequality issues in every society. And I'm just wondering what reflections, as an extension to your previous answer, what reflections you've had around what responsibilities leaders in significant organizations have for questioning that and looking at ways in which that model might change or move or be refined.
Yeah, I think this is a tough question. I don't think there is, my view on an economic model that it will solve it. But I think, as I said, I think just the increasing public pressure by companies, and there's more in sync now, I think, between what an employee wants, if you sort of took a business's wider ecosystem, it sort of felt like a trade-off before, that if you, increased benefit in one camp, like employees, maybe investors don't want that because they want a higher return, or maybe you did something for the planet, there was a trade-off with investors or whatever. I think we're seeing that, all of the sort of wider stakeholder of a company are now far more connected in what they want. They want you to achieve your purpose and your vision and what you are trying to set out to achieve. And so I think there's less clashing between all the stakeholder groups than there has been historically. And I think they're all members of the public, so they wear all hats as well. So I think just that increasing public pressure to be good corporate citizens, I think is helping businesses do the right thing, because it's the right thing to do, and it's what you've perhaps always felt, but you know that you'll be judged positively for it, and it will assist with your brand and reputation as well. So, yeah, I don't think the economic model, is one or the other is going to fix it, but I just think, as a society, we're conscious of the trends that we don't like that we're seeing, and I think as leaders, you bring that. I think you don't want to bring your personal prejudice or view to the table, but I think overall, being a better corporate citizen, I think is definitely far more in the equation. Especially for longevity. When I talked about Gallagher's been around for 85 years, it's all about the values of relationship, and you can't survive for that long unless you've got strong values and you live to be and you are a good corporate citizen.
It's an interesting one for Gallagher's, isn't it? Because you're not only a player in New Zealand, you're a player globally. So
Correct.
presumably, then you have to address the question of what are mega values, if you like, or values that are pertinent in all the jurisdictions you do business in. How do you address that question?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. Look, I think as businesses get more distributed, you run risk of silo mentality. A long time ago, Gallagher was a number of disparate companies, full stop. We had a security business, animal management. We had brands for products. We had brands for divisions. Everyone thought they were different to the other. And I think we've done a lot of work to get rid of the silo mentality and create one organization called Gallagher. We have divisions, but everyone works for the same company. And I think it's very much a focus of ours is to drive a consistent corporate culture of expectations and values through that globally, so that when people are making individual decisions, that they're reflecting on the corporate values and culture. But I think real leadership really starts at the top, and we've had to make some hard calls over our many years of business about things in all social areas that may have been completely acceptable 20, 30 years ago, but they aren't today. And I think when staff see leaders making really firm decisions and being able to make a change as to what's appropriate for today and stamp on behavior that's not appropriate quite hard and quickly, I think that's where it starts. I think when you get into trouble is when you are soft on the values and you make concessions and you put up with some people perhaps that don't live the values but they're a good staff member or whatever. I think we're seeing culture as so much more valuable now that we're taking greater steps to protect it and to build it and protect it.
Okay, thank you. In terms of change globally, and particularly now, we're being hit by a whole host of different challenges that are quite worrying, particularly with the global economy so challenged currently. What are the current global trends in your mind that are the greatest threats, if you like, to stable economic prosperity, not only for nations but for corporates?
Yeah, I think the way I like to sort of look at is concerns or risks or what keeps you up at night. I don't think it's as black and white as that. In fact, we've just put in a risk management module at the company I'm in, and the converse, the opposite side of that is a strategy module, and they're completely integrated. And the reason I say that is I think most concerns and risks are also opportunities if you adjust your leadership in your business to take advantage of them. So I think many are what we see as risks are just because we're not used to that, and so it's change, and us as leaders, we you initially resist change. It's a human instinct, but if you embrace it and think about how to operate in that environment, opportunities can fall out. But having said that, look, you can't brush over things like the global pandemic, which has made us think about distributed working and our supply chains and whether they were suitable for that environment. I think we've got increasing global tensions. I think that are and could continue to affect trade. I think there's the whole risk of us sort of falling into some type of global recession to some degree. Jury's out, but I think there's a very real possibility there. But I think I always say to people, because I always find when you see board reports, when things are going well, there's a thousand reasons why things are going well. The sales reps are implemented this new, CRM system or whatever, and it's starting to pay dividends. And when things don't go well, people try to distance themselves from it and they blame it on economic or external factors and the context around you. I always try to say to people, even if you're in a global recession and, you go from a possible market size of 100 and 5% negative growth takes 5% away from you at 95, but you've only got a 5% market share, that shouldn't affect you. There's a huge amount of opportunity. So I tend to look at these things as to some extent don't get overly paralyzed by the external factors. It's about building a better business no matter what the external factors are. And I think too many people get too caught up in the external environment, and whereas I think building a better business is the focus. And to some extent, what will happen around you. You adjust, but it isn't as big a factor as doing good business.
So, is there nothing that's sort of tested that approach in terms of a sustainable business moving forward, working with within a risk framework? Is there anything that's been really unusual that you didn't expect, that you had to adapt and adjust to quite quickly?
Yeah, look, I think everyone would say probably the only thing in my 25-year career that has happened as fast and impacted us as greatly has been COVID, of course. And I think that was quite a shock, obviously. But look, I think we were ready technology-wise for the likes of the Zooms and the Teams. We had mechanisms in place. I was lucky that a lot of the companies I worked for were able to continue. Look, I think the only real fallout there has been supply chains. People were relying on low inventories and getting product, from far away at times with long lead times. And I think, it's moved us back towards resilience and thinking about where our inventory potentially is, who is making it for us, and perhaps being a little bit more cautious about the inventories we hold and knowing that our supply chains could be extended. So, look, I think yes, that did, but look, I think there's also an after effect of COVID. A lot of organisations that I'm seeing now trying to come out the other end of it, it felt pretty rosy to some extent at the time. But I think there's a lingering effect that's going to be with us for a couple of years. So coming back to some of the core, running a business is relatively easy when you've got growth and money and good return. But I think more and more we're learning to lead businesses that are struggling a little bit in some way. And I think that's when leadership is really tested. Harder decisions need to be made. And that's a new challenge that we haven't perhaps been used to in times of high prosperity. So, I think the next 5 years is going to also require some leaders that can, take companies out of a few headwinds and into a better place.
I think you're certainly right around leadership resilience. A lot of businesses do spend time addressing the leadership issue in terms of succession planning and development plans for leaders, particularly in these particularly distressed times. What at Gallagher are you doing, and is your board doing, to ensure that there is leadership resilience, strong succession, leadership that's ready for anything, if you like?
Yeah, good question. Look, I think, first of all, we were really excited when I sort of stepped away from full-time executive role a couple of years ago, that we recruited from within and put Carl Beetham in as our CEO. So, I think we're a testament to, I think the good thing about a long-serving company is we've also got a lot of staff with strong loyalty. And I think there is a healthy mix between having good, solid staff members that know and understand the history of the business, as well as a new mix of individuals and fresh people coming in. So I think that's where we come back to retention being an important strategy, and making sure you do have some succession that you can rely on and that you feel can be promoted and will be with you for a period of time. I think, look, Gallagher's has been really lucky. We're a growing company, and when there's growth, there's new opportunities, there's funds to fund new initiatives, and there's always new and exciting things. So there's opportunities to promote people. I think when you have limited opportunity to promote, some other companies I've seen, I think you've got to let some people go of their own accord so that they can go outside the organization, get some experience, get some new skills, and then later on, 3-5 years down the track, I've been involved even at Gallagher's many times where we've brought people, good quality people back. So I think sometimes it's the way you look at retention, is that sometimes you've got to think what's best for the person to develop their skills, and sometimes that's going and then returning to you. And if you've been a great place to work, they'll want to return, and it might be 3 to 5 years down the track, and you've got the role they can go into. So in terms of leadership development, look, we've been building a really strong executive team and the layer below, putting in OKRs and things so that all of our teams are centered around what the purpose is of the organization, what our key goals are. I think all the things of, good communication, good well-being, focusing on retention, and having good succession plans.
Okay, no, that's really great. Thank you. You mentioned earlier some tactics, I suppose, that you use to stay in shape, whether it's sort of exercising daily or whatever. All these things are important. What other personal strategies do you use to ensure you're in the best shape to lead?
I think, as I sort of said earlier, I think the key for me is really things particularly in my new role because I'm across multiple organizations with multiple stresses, anything that has helped me relax more, be in the moment, not sweat the small stuff. I think they've all been sort of part of my personal development journey over the last few years. And I think they, as a consequence, have really helped me stay focused on things that matter. Look, I think I mentioned them and they sound so cliche, but you really can't go past the simple things like finding a bit of time for diet, exercise, life balance, reflection. But I do acknowledge these are all easier said than done. And, I did remind myself that I did step out of an executive role 3 years ago, and part of it was to be fitter, and I only joined the gym last week. So, these things, it's easier to say than to do. But I think for me, those have been the key on a personal front.
If you were looking back in time and in hindsight, wanted to give yourself some good advice at the beginning of your executive career, let's say, and you've talked a little bit about this in terms of your accounting and finance background and how that sort of set you up for a very structured view of the world, but things have moved on since then. But if you were giving yourself a piece of really good advice right at the start of your career, what would it have been, and why do you choose that particular piece of advice?
Yeah, a couple of things. When I think back to things that had an impact on the way I think, I probably would have read them earlier. So I know this sounds probably, again, a couple of cliche books. I'm sure we've all read them, but the Stephen Covey habits, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Seek first to understand before you're understood. If I had sort of read that and digested that earlier, I think the other thing, which again happened a little bit later in my leadership journey, was going on a negotiation course. And when I talk about a negotiation course, I mean sort of a David Foreman, I think it was at the time, but focus very much on that win-win, seeing negotiation as a trade, not a win or a lose. I think they would have really helped me in the early days. But in overall, I think a philosophy, I'm going to quote a line from my favorite poem, which was by Dana Folds, and it says, "Let go of the ways you thought life would unfold." And I think, to me, this is about accepting that things don't always go to plan, having less attachment, being more flexible, enjoying the journey. Very much all cliche, sort of modern sort of statements, but I think I would have done what I'd done, but perhaps been more relaxed in doing it, and probably appeared a more calmer and a person as a result. So, look, whether I would have listened to all that advice 30 years ago, that's a completely different question. But look, I think just centered around sort of philosophies of thought more than particular learnings.
Right. And as you think about the Gallagher business in particular now, and you think about the global economy, and you think about the state of the world, what are your thoughts about the this is not a scheduled question, but I'm just interested in what are your thoughts about New Zealand's place in the world and what the opportunities are for this country, and what we need from a leadership perspective to see those things happen?
Yeah, good question. I think prior to the pandemic, a lot of people looked at what Gallagher were doing, and when there was perhaps the drive to lower costs and people were sending product offshore to manufacture, and companies were evolving that didn't have their own manufacture or their own R&D. They were just one piece of that puzzle, and everyone was working as integrated supply chain. I think Gallagher sort of rocked the trend in that we're a very vertically integrated manufacturer. We have our own injection molding tools and dies. We make our own tools and dies. We stuff circuit boards, and then we right through to distributing and marketing it globally and having our own marketing team. So I sort of feel that that's been a huge value and asset for us in these times when everything has become distributed and people haven't performed at one step of the chain and you've been reliant. And I think we don't have enough technology companies. When I look at Gallagher's and that drive we've had historically for other companies to send stuff offshore, I think of historically great manufacturers like, say, Germany, high quality, but also comes with high cost. We're nowhere near Germany or the USA for manufacture, but perhaps we aren't as cheap as Thailand or somewhere else in some other parts of Asia. So I think we sit in the middle, and I think the real key to Gallagher's success has been recognizing that there's a cycle, I call it, of having confidence that people want good innovation that solves problems for them. If we focus on R&D and innovation and selling people what they want, we can charge a premium. If we can charge a slight premium, we get scale and we get a lower cost of manufacture, and we get slightly higher profitability, and we just keep feeding that loop of R&D, innovation, margin, and so I think if you can stay outside the commodity trap by continuing to innovate, and I think there's really good, solid evidence that we can build really successful companies out in New Zealand. Fisher & Paykel Healthcare, Gallagher, just to name a few that are in that sort of technology space of strong manufacturers and marketers. So I think we that's what we could do more of. I don't quite know how, but I think also people taking a long-term view, and there's a lot of talk about this. People sort of see building a company, accelerating it fast, and flicking it on as sort of success. I think we're missing the people that perhaps are starting early in their career, but see this as a 20 or 30-year journey, and to build something that they, rather than sort of a quick exit and getting someone to pay a higher multiple and let them worry about it afterwards. So, look, I know that's sometimes a bit simplistic. It's a different world in terms of capital and liquidity and how fast you have to act. But I think, good, solid, long-term manufacturing related, finding good distribution, and then slowly morphing into taking control of your marketing and distribution over time and becoming a global entity, I think is where Gallagher's success rims from.
It's really interesting. You referenced to sort of a fully integrated process. I was reading something the other day around the trend in the past, and whether it continues or not, I don't know, amongst many big corporates of attempting to outsource as much as they possibly can on the basis of thinking that it can lead to efficiency. But what it often leads to is an assumption that we don't have to worry about that piece because it's outsourced. And your comments fly in the face of that philosophy.
I think so. Look, I'm really careful to say some things work for one company and not another. So I'm conscious of saying this is not a philosophy, but it's certainly worked for us. And if anything, we've looked to bring them back in-house. I think it comes back to what I said before about that 80-20 rule. I think, if you're making good, strong margins and, there's better energy to put into growing your marketing and sales forces and pushing into new markets. And everything takes executive time. And if you're focused on squeezing out the last dollar out of manufacturing, but your manufactured cost is, 30-40% of the sale price, and you're squeezing out another 1 or 2% out of that, you're better trying to grow sales 3 or 4%. It'll have far bigger benefit and impact. So I think there is a trade-off on where you direct your executives, and it comes back to what I said before, both 80-20 and also focusing on the things that really drive value. And I think if you're a manufacturer that makes or a marketer that makes very low margins, of course that's your focus area. But if it's not, I don't think get overly caught up. And it's more about, as I said earlier, doing the right thing. Being a good employer, good well-being. Making locally where we've been able to, and securing your supply chain as a result.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. Steve, thanks very much for your time today. It's been illuminating and edifying, and thoroughly interesting. Is there anything to conclude on this leadership theme, and what makes great leaders in demanding times that you'd like to finish on?
No, not really. Look, I think great leaders in demanding times. Look, I think it's just depth of experience, and some of it does take a bit of time. It's a learned skill. It's about self-reflection. I think you've got to be constantly thinking about how you are performing, how you're coming across, without beating yourself up about it. But at the same time, I don't think you can develop to be a good leader unless you've got good, strong self-reflection. So it is part of a self-development journey for your own personality and the way you are and who you are and how you come across. I think are factors that you continue need to reflect on and work on, and don't see it as a separate part of you. It's just part of who you are. And so that would be my only thing is time and reflection.
A better person, a better leader.
Correct, yeah.
Steve, that's a great note to finish on. Thank you very, very much.